All right, Adam, I want to go back to the beginning. When did journalism or career in journalism first get on your radar?
I'm trying to think of, there's sort of the sports pathway, but I actually joined a children's news service. This is going to really date me. This is like early 90s. We'd moved out from Massachusetts in the Boston area to the Bay Area, like to where I really grew up in Berkeley. And, I had shown some interest clearly in journalism because my mom, like all Jewish moms, wants to do best for her kid, and found a group that was called Children's Express, and they did like news stories that were related to kids. So like the amount of lead that was in water in the schools, that kind of thing. We would do interviews, and then we would, like, the older kids would then turn it into a story that sometimes went out on a news wire. But that was like, I want to say 92, 93. I was probably like 11, 12 years old. And then, in high school, I wrote for the school paper and ended up editing the school paper, and then was sort of off and running at that point. But I would say it was that, like, before, like, middle school, elementary school, and, sixth, seventh grade, I at least showed enough of an interest to start doing these interviews. We would wear these, like, bright yellow shirts with red lettering because we wanted to stand out whenever we would cover, major events. Like, it covered conventions. I actually think they actually broke the story of one of the running mates in the 80s. I forget which one it was. It may have been like one of the 84 convention. Like the vice presidential thing was broken by like a kid reporter who was just standing in the elevator wearing a yellow shirt. So.
Wow. Do you remember did 9-year-old Adam Rittenberg interview anybody important? Were you running around with your yellow shirt?
You know who we interviewed? I think it was for I don't know why it would have been for this, because it wouldn't have been for any other outlet that I worked for. We interviewed a state senator in California. I think her name was Jackie Spear, but she was part of the contingent that went down to Jonestown and wherever that was in Guyana, and like was there when everything went down. So that was like, and we didn't interview her about that, but like she was like right there for all the crazy like Kool-Aid stuff, the Jonestown stuff, because like Bay Area politics in the late 70s were just wild. And so I remember interviewing her. I don't even know what it was. Oh, you know what it was? I think she had proposed that like California, in California you always get these interesting proposals, but it was that if you were allowed to be tried as an adult, you should be able to vote or something, like at the same age. I don't think because I guess it was 18, or there was some type of like equivalence. Like, hey, if we're gonna try these kids as adults, they should also be allowed to vote or drive or do something that they weren't allowed to do at that particular age.
Wow, look at you as a child was uncovering the hard news, and now it's a kids game, football, that you're reporting on.
Ranking offensive linemen. So I've really gone down in the world since then. It's all been a drop since age 12.
All right, so you did go to the greatest institution in the country, in the world, the best college ever, obviously Northwestern University. What was it like being in Medill School of Journalism when you were there? Like, obviously a lot of people there with really high ambition. I've talked to people on this podcast about like the Syracuse and the Mizzou. It's an interesting to be. We also have people on this podcast who didn't go to schools like that. So it's a very different environment. But what was it like for you when you were there, surrounded by people who all want to get into this business?
Yeah, I think one of the differences, and I don't know if you probably could speak to this more just because you talked to these folks about that time, but my perception of it is it always felt smaller than some of the other journalism factories like Syracuse, like Mizzou. I mean, those are large public schools. Northwestern, there just wasn't that many people, but there certainly were memorable people. One of the first people I met, kind of in pursuing the student journalism role, was a guy by the name of Darren Ravel. He was the sports director at WNER, which is the campus radio station. And, I'm like, oh my God, I can have my voice on the air and do something in the audio space. And I did like one women's soccer audio piece that they forgot to run on their weekend show, and like that was the end of my time at WNUR. But I certainly remember Darren, and when I was interning at ESPN, I think I stayed at his house one night, or his condo, when he was really young and just started to work there. I remembered him. Another guy that I remember at that time was Tommy Craggs, who is
Hmm.
the sports editor at the Daily Northwestern, who a lot of people will know from his talented works throughout the years at different outlets. So yeah, but it just didn't feel like there were that many. I mean, there certainly were. Mark Lazarus, who's your colleague at the Athletic, does a great job covering the Blackhawks. Was I think a beat writer or a columnist already at the Daily when I started there. And Mark's claim to fame was, and which is still sort of true, is being able to like spit out a column in like 28 minutes. So
Yep.
if some idiot freshman who's covering the swimming team forgets to file their story and we have a hole in the paper, Laz would just like come up with something and we'd just have a newspaper the next day. So those are some people that the audience might know of, but there were certainly some others, but it just wasn't like a mass of them. And we had a lot of people, kind of after me, like you and others who have kind of gone on. I almost feel like that when I was there, it wasn't this huge group that wanted to work in sports and wanted to be on TV or write for Sports Illustrated or whatever. It was kind of a smaller group back then.
You mentioned it a little bit earlier, and you and I talked about this last night. You interned at ESPN.com in 2001, correct?
Yes.
So what
Yes.
was ESPN.com like in 2001?
Yeah, it was. I think it was like even the website address was maybe like espn.sportszone.com, or it had just come out of the Sports Zone era, and it was so different. So that summer, I'd applied for all these internships and had kind of struck out at all the major newspapers. And then there was a job fair at the end of I guess it would have been spring of 2001. And I met a guy at the job fair who turned out to be an editor at ESPN, who was also at Northwestern to do like a spring football story because Northwestern was predicted to be really good in the 2001 season. So I talked to him at the job fair, and I saw him at the spring football practice, and then kind of continued to stay in touch. Guy named by the name of Dave Albright, and again, ESPN.com, I didn't even know they had internships, and they did. They had two. It was myself and another college student. And what's wild, Kevin, is like from that moment, stepping on the campus in Bristol, I guess it would have been in June of that summer. I've had an affiliation with ESPN because I freelanced for them my last 2 years of college. Again, it speaks to the fact that like they didn't have a huge staff. Like, why would they let an idiot college student like me and pay me for it? I would send in these notebooks about the Sun Belt and Conference USA. I did some Notre Dame stuff, but I essentially did that throughout my last 2 years of college and even during my time at the Daily Herald. So yeah, I always say like, yeah, I've worked there officially since February of 2008, but I've been affiliated with ESPN since June of 2001, which is just an insanely long time. So it's obviously changed a lot. It used to be just in the basement of one of the buildings on the campus there at ESPN. I think they still had a lot of their operations out of Seattle at the time, and really small staff, very very few pieces of content. The types of content that we would do would be really different. These mailbags and like celebrity Q&As, and I think I did a celebrity Q&A with one of the actors who was in Caddyshack. So that was like one of the things I did that summer. Just like a total grunt work. Very very few staff writers, a lot of freelance people, but it's obviously grown and changed a lot since then.
The your first job you mentioned it was the Daily Herald, coming out of college. How did you get that job?
Right. So I mean, this is going to go really into the weeds. So you'll understand it being a Northwestern person. So at Northwestern, at least back then, during your junior year, you would do a quarter off campus, either at a newspaper, a television station, or a magazine. And I was sort of in the newspaper track, and everyone back then wanted to go to the Palm Beach Post because they had a sports opening and they would let you do everything, Dolphins, and I guess it would be winter oftentimes, so it would be like basketball, but you could do anything there, and it was a great feeder for people who went on and worked professionally. So that's where I thought I was going to go, and then my parents sort of figured out, okay, this is going to cost a lot of money for you to go live in South Florida. Is there anything local? And the Daily Herald, was local. It allowed me to stay on campus. I was able just to drive out to their office every day. So I basically did an internship there. While I was at Northwestern, as I guess this would have been early 2002, maybe no, early 2001. And then again, kind of like the ESPN deal, continued to freelance. So hey, do you need me to cover the Northwestern basketball game or whatever else? And they back then. They were really covering a lot. They were covering all the Chicago pro teams with a traveling writer. They had a couple of college writers, or at least one full-time college writer, Lindsay Wilhite, who's a longtime friend and mentor for me. And they needed help. So, after doing that internships, I didn't screw up so bad. And they let me, I remember covering a Bears playoff game against the Eagles. I helped out with a Blackhawks playoff game. And then basically once I graduated, they offered me what was essentially like a year-long let's pay you like an intern, but you're essentially an employee type of job, and then that turned into the full time job. So it was again a long affiliation with them essentially until I got the actual job after graduation, and then right up until I left for ESPN.
All right, well, one of the first stories I found from you was August 24th, 2003, headline Defensive Letdowns Cost Flyers. And here's your lead. Brant Brown knows how it feels to make defensive mistakes in big games. And Adam, I should point out, as somebody who grew up a Cubs fan, like just reading that still gives me some chills from what happened in 1998. After all, the Schaumburg Flyers first baseman left fielder is best remembered for dropping a fly ball that cost the Cubs a game late in the 1998 season at Milwaukee. So here's Brant Brown. He's in Schaumburg. Here's you. You're a young sports writer. Head over to Schaumburg Flyers. Fans of this podcast know the first episode of this podcast was with Joe Davis, who I met on the Schaumburg Flyers radio booth. So I have obviously a soft spot for anything Schaumburg Flyers related. But I thought that was funny. That was your first ballot. What do you remember about covering minor league baseball? Independent league baseball, really.
Yeah.
As you got started in your career.
Yeah, it was super fun. So like that was the beat that they sort of gave, whoever was around, who could do it. And, this is the summer after I graduated. We would cover pretty much every home game, which is insane to think about at the time. And there were literally dozens of people, I'm sure, that were reading my Schaumburg Flyers game reports. But it was great. Like, I was living in the city, so it was a real schlep, as our people say, to get out there every day to that kind of Arlington Heights, Schaumburg area. But what I normally do would be work in the office in Arlington Heights, make calls, work on whatever, and then I would drive over to, I think it was Alexian Field, right there, kind of in West Schaumburg, and watch baseball. And it was super fun. And it was the first. I'd covered beats obviously in college, but there's such limited access, and this is the first time where I could go talk to players and coaches before games, and really got a rapport with some of the guys on the team. And Brant, who again was really at the end of his baseball career at that point, became my go-to because the other guys didn't handle losses that well, and they were younger and immature. They weren't really used to having to talk to the media, whereas Brant Brown was like, I'll talk to whoever. It doesn't matter how the game goes. And he was an awesome guy to deal with. I remember liking the manager. They actually had really good food, so it was a great way to like end the day. And then I would file my story and then make the hour or 45-minute drive back to wherever I was living at the time in Chicago. And that's how a lot of those nights went. So like super memorable summer. And I even remember some of the other players who were on the team. I befriended the beat writer from the Winnipeg team, which they would actually travel a beat writer down. Wow. His name was Greg something. I should try to find his last name and reconnect with him. But he would come down from Winnipeg to cover their games against the Flyers, and they played the St. Paul Saints. And I was a little familiar with them, so it was great. Like a lot of work essentially for not that much on the back end, or at least time, but a really good experience for somebody who was just starting out.
You mentioned how the Daily Herald this time was covering everything. And, the first time like Adam Rittenberg came across my screen or my newspaper was, I'm obviously a big Northwestern fan. I would read your Northwestern and DePaul coverage in the Daily Herald. And I pulled up one of the first Northwestern stories from you here in 2003. The lead here, and I want to bring this to you more for Professor Rittenberg, because you teach journalism at DePaul. Here we go. A steady rain in Kansas saturated the Northwestern football team during Saturday's season opener, but a 28-20 victory left players walking on air. You like that one?
Terrible, just terrible. The weather leads. I read some of the stuff and like the wordiness and the trying to be cute. I mean, there was a group of us. It was funny. Joe Cowley would call us the Rat Pack, like younger reporters who would cover, baseball back then. And some of the leads that we would come up with and things are just it's just cringy. And so yeah, that was. I actually remember that game though. That was the first. I think that was the opening game of the 2003 season, and they went down and they beat Kansas in a monsoon. So I wasn't actually at that game, but thought it was worth recapping with a weather lead. So young reporters out there, avoid the weather lead at all costs.
Well, I wanted to ask you about not that game per se, but through your years, and you still do it now. Here we are, 22 years later, covering Northwestern that early, because I feel like a lot of people who are listening to this, who are young, who maybe write for their college paper or do their college radio station, like there might be an opportunity for them to cover their college team as a professional. What was that like for you? I mean, now again, you're so far removed. You've been in this business for a long time, but like right away when you're 23 and you were just, I mean, you did cover them the daily, so you kind of got used to what it was like to be a beat writer, but what was the dynamic like when you shifted to, I am now covering you as like a paid person who this is my job to do it?
Yeah, I mean that was the cool part, is that it really wasn't that different. I knew the coaches and the players and the environment. I knew how to cover a game. I knew where to park and where to get a credential and where the post game press conference was, at least for home games. So it was fun, and what was nice too was it wasn't just that. I did Northwestern. I helped out with. I actually covered a Northern Illinois team in 2003, which was like an amazing 10-2 team that beat Alabama on the road, but somehow didn't go to a bowl game. And so there was this whole controversy because Northwestern went to a bowl game because it was in the Big Ten, and NIU didn't, even though it was a much better team. And so there was a little bit of variety, but yeah, I mean, sitting there as a professional it was fun. And again, I've had a chance to sort of cover them here and there, even at ESPN. Not so much games, but writing stories on them. And yeah, it's an incredible long affiliation. Having been there as a student, and then early in my career, and now obviously quite a bit into my career. Yeah, it's obviously a place that means a lot, and that I'll obviously follow and continue to write about but it's obviously harder at ESPN because it's a national outlet. We're not going to cover them nearly. Back then, the Daily Herald, even though we didn't have 6 college writers, we really tried to cover as much as we could, Lindsay and I, and then we had some help. John Greenberg, who you work with, I remember calling him to help out with freelance work as a basketball guy. Scott Powers, another one of your colleagues, I gave him a few assignments with college basketball. So yeah, we really tried to do a lot back then as a newspaper, even though in terms of staff wise and reach and whatever, we were well behind the Tribune and Sun Times, but the Daily Herald really tried to keep up pretty well.
Now, listen, as somebody who was a diehard DePaul basketball and Northwestern football fan in the early aughts, I could tell you the Daily Herald's college coverage was go-to for me. I needed that. All right, what was your welcome to the big leagues moment? It could have been Daily Herald, could have been ESPN.com internship, could have been when we haven't gotten, obviously, when you started the ESPN Big Ten blog. But if you had to think of kind of your, oh wow, I'm here. This is real life. I'm dealing with these professionals. What stands to mind?
Yeah, I mean, an early one was being at the Bartman game. I mean, I was like the 11th writer, for the Herald, and this is the 2003 NL Championship Series with the Cubs and Marlins. And I remember I was in the old lunchroom at Wrigley because there was no seat for me, because the press box and the press seating was so cramped there. And so covering that was obviously memorable. Covering the World Series in 2005 with the White Sox. And I remember, one of my jobs was like Bill Melton was a guest columnist. So I would call him after every game, and he would dictate his column to me, and I would write that down. So this isn't super high level work, but I was in the ballpark, and I remember seeing all the national media there, and being there for those 2 home games, and I was at the USC Notre Dame game, the Bush push game in 2005. So all those early on were big moments. And then getting to work for ESPN, I remember just feeling a ton of pressure, even though I had freelance for them, and I'd written stories that in some cases appeared on the front page of ESPN.com. But to be an employee in 2008, I remember covering like the Missouri Valley basketball tournament down in St. Louis, and writing a story on that, and just feeling super nervous because I just knew a lot more people were going to be seeing this, and it was just at a much bigger publication. So yeah, I think those are probably some that stood out, but definitely those early, being at the playoff, being at the Bartman game, certainly are ones that I won't forget.
I'm always interested by people that have stuck with, a sport, or for your sake, two sports, if you count college basketball, for such a long time. Do you remember at what point that you thought college sports is just where I want to be, what I want to do? You're probably at a point in your career, it'd be hard to see yourself doing anything else. But early on, was there a gravitation, or a realization, hey, I want to really stick with this. This is something I'm good at. It's something I love, and wanting to stick to it? Or was it a little bit more serendipitous than that?
Yeah, it's a good question to me because there was definitely, early on it was very need based. Like, the Herald didn't have a huge college sports staff, and I liked college sports. I'd done it obviously as a student reporter, so why not continue to contribute? And as I was around college football in particular, but college basketball as well, year after year, I really liked the stories. I liked the characters. I liked the rhythm of it. But I also was filling in quite a lot with baseball, just as a kind of weekend helper, when to give the beat writer a break for those home weekends. So I was around Wrigley and I was around the Sox quite a bit at that time. And, do you pursue that? Do you pursue the NFL? I mean, I remember sending out, this is probably 2005, 2006, and, applying for jobs all over the place, including here in Chicago, and not really getting any of them. And you're kind of hoping in the back of my mind, maybe ESPN will hire me. Because again, ESPN, people forget, had such a small staff, really until 2006, 2007. There wasn't an NFL writing staff. There wasn't really a college football writing staff. Like Andy Katz worked there. Katz was there when I was an intern, but he was one of the few staff writers. Wayne Drays was there as sort of a do everything kind of writer. But they really relied on freelancers, so it was sort of a pipe dream. Would they ever hire me? And fortunately, they changed their strategy, kind of in 2007 to say, hey, we need more people writing about football. And I already had that foothold. So it wasn't an extensive interview. They knew what I could do. And, fortunately, it's been a long-term partnership. But I think as you get older, and we've talked about this a lot, we have families. This is a really hard job to do, period. It's a lot harder to do if you're covering baseball or the NBA. Football in many ways, and hockey, I would throw that in there too. Football in many ways lends itself much more to a normal-ish schedule, normal-ish life. You're not going to a ton of games. There is travel, but it's not as constant, or just bouncing around the way it is with baseball or NBA or hockey. So it just made sense, and I enjoy the sport and some of the issues around the sport. I enjoy even the NFL draft component. I've really grown to like writing about the draft and about prospects, and probably less so with recruiting and NIL, but that's obviously part of it as well. You can't ignore those things if you're a college football reporter.
Okay, if you look at yourself, Adam Rittenberg today, 2025, gearing up for the college football season, we're talking ahead of Big Ten Media Days next week. You're at Big 12 Media Days last week. You've got all these connections with, coaches and ADs around the country, writing some major stories for ESPN.com. Okay, and then you think about 2003, Adam Rittenberg, who's in that Schaumburg Flyers clubhouse, who's doing those stories on NIU. What's that through line? What are some of the things that you honed, you learned, you taught yourself, you figured out that still matters today?
Yeah, fewer weather leads. I think again, I look at things that I wrote even 5-6 years ago, and would like to think that I've improved in terms of how I think about stories, how I report stories, how I ask questions. One thing that I think has definitely helped me, I always bring this up because I feel like I didn't do a good job of it early in my career, but I must have done a decent job of building relationships, because I think early on I saw those interactions as really transactional. Like, I need something from you, I need information from you, instead of I want to build a relationship with you because that's going to serve me beyond whatever 12-inch story, or if it's a radio piece, a 90-second piece that I'm working on. Like there's value in this relationship, and I think I've certainly tried to do that. In the last 15 years or so I've been at ESPN, maybe last 12 years, is, hey, it's about relationships, it's about growing the network, it's about keeping up with these people beyond whatever quote or nugget I need from them for whatever story I'm working on. So, but again, I think I would like to think that I've improved in, I think, the areas that matter in terms of identifying good stories, interviewing people, crafting stories, being creative in how you tell stories. Just to try to stand out. And again, I think, for those that maybe are thinking about getting into the media, know that it's really about who you know. I mean, I know that's sort of cliche, but if you don't know people and you can't access people, you're not going to make it, because others will, and others, those who have those relationships and are not even willing but excited about growing your network, are those that are likelier to last. You can be the greatest writer in the world, you can be a very talented person on the air, but if you aren't someone who wants to build relationships, you're going to have a hard time surviving in the field for any significant period of time.
Along those lines, I always like to ask my guests their advice to people who are trying to break in. You come at this from a unique perspective because you teach a class at DePaul. I've spoken to your class. So you get this question all the time from your students, current and former. So what are some key things, you talk about the relationships, what are key things you tell them? I mean, we always talk, it's an interesting time for journalism, because on the one hand, it's not, the Daily Herald isn't sending 11 people to, Cubs playoff games, but there's all these other outlets, all these other ways to get, to tell stories. So what's kind of some of your go-to pieces of advice?
Yeah, in addition to relationship, I think you have to be, there needs to be a versatility about your profile. So it doesn't mean you have to be elite at everything. I'm not the world's greatest writer, reporter, or on-air person, or radio person, but I have a comfort and a competency to do all of those mediums. So, I would always tell and I tell my students this, like, assess yourself. Like, what are you good at? What do you want to do ultimately? What are you good at? And what needs improvement in your profile? And work on the things that need improvement. I mean, I think, and maybe this stuff was always available, but I really, when I came out of Northwestern, or even at the Herald, I did not do much other than writing. Like in terms of, well, typing, I guess it wouldn't be physical writing, but I wasn't doing a lot of radio. I wasn't doing hardly any television. Your social media wasn't really a thing back then. So now you have all those things at your disposal, a lot of them just through your phone. Practice those things, and things that you think that you're not good at or you don't want to do, spend more time on those. I mean, it drives me crazy when I hear students, well, I don't like writing. I just don't want to do it. You don't have to do what you and I do, Kevin. I mean, some of the best writers we know are TV people, or radio people. I mean, it's not just people who write words for a living to tell stories that way. So again, I think that figuring out your weaknesses, and at least having a willingness and enthusiasm to try all those things and go into the market with a skill set that makes you valuable to employers is really key. And then again, the relationship thing is very, very important. I really wish I went into the professional life knowing how important those relationships were from the very start, instead of figuring it out somewhat midway through my career.
You don't have to necessarily name the coach or person, but do you remember a relationship where it kind of sparked, like whether it was I don't know if you broke a story or wrote a story, and it kind of like dawned on you, like, oh wow, this is something that if I keep doing this, I'm going to continue to build my network and have other things that come through.
Well, I don't know if there's anyone I can think of specifically, but one thing that has, covering coaches, for example, like a lot of the head coaches I cover now, like, oh, here's a good one. So Kalen DeBoer, who's the head coach at Alabama, one of the highest profile teams in college football. I met him when he was the offensive coordinator at Eastern Michigan. I met him through a mutual friend of ours, Juan Lozano, who was his agent back then, and I could have said, well, what do I need to talk to this guy from Eastern Michigan for? I mean, that's a low level Mac school. He's not going to really help me, doing my job. Why do I need to build a relationship with him? Well, he then became an offensive coordinator in the Big Ten, and then he became a head coach, and then lo and behold, he's playing for a national championship with Washington a couple of years ago, and now he's the head coach at Alabama. So, Kalen's a guy and he's like this with a lot of media. I'm not just saying I'm the only one, but he's a guy that if I text him, he'll respond. I mean, he's not going to blow me off, and he'll help me out with my job and be fair with me, and there's a lot of relationships like that. But again, I would like to think that it helps that I knew him when he was, not somebody who a lot of reporters were flocking to, and I tried to build a relationship with him and a lot of people that were like him in those roles, and look at what they've become now. Another example, I went down to Ohio State to do a story on Kevin Wilson, who was their new offensive coordinator, a guy that I covered at Northwestern when he was the offensive coordinator there. He was, by the way, a great guy for a young reporter to be around because he was super direct, and you had to come with good questions because Kevin just wasn't going to mess around. He didn't have a huge tolerance for BS. So anyway, I went to Ohio State to do a piece on Kevin, but they said, hey, we're gonna put you in the quarterbacks meetings so you can just see what these guys are like. And the guy that's running them is Ryan Day. He's a young assistant that we brought in. Urban brought him in from their time at Florida. I didn't know Ryan Day, but I sat in his quarterback meeting. It was Ryan Day leading the meeting. JT Barrett was the starter at the time. Joe Burrow was the likely backup. The late Dwayne Haskins was in the room, and then Tate Martell, who was kind of a controversial a young quarterback. So that was in me. And that's how I got to know Ryan Day. And obviously he goes on and becomes the head coach. And, we have a pretty good relationship that all started back from that day I spent, I think it was before the 2016 or 17 season down in Columbus. So those early interactions and then maintaining the relationships are really, really important for me and for you and anyone who kind of wants some staying power in the business.
Let's wrap with a couple things for the present. Not about you breaking in, but about college football season. I'll put you on the spot. Give me one under the radar team that, your sleeper team, your kind of program that you're very fascinated about for this upcoming 2025 season.
Yeah, it's tough in the Big Ten or SEC. I think a lot of those teams, get their due and get talked about. I mean, I think it's fast. It'll be fascinating to see how Illinois does coming off of the season they had, and whether they can build on it and sort of become this year's version of Indiana. The team they played in their bowl game, South Carolina, is kind of in that same mold. I think the Big 12 is going to be fascinating because nobody expected Arizona State to win it last year. They were picked last in the preseason media poll, and I was just down there, and there's just so many teams I look at. I'm like, wow. Their quarterback comes back. They have some really good players. Not a lot of changes on their coaching staff. Like TCU is a really interesting team to me. They open up against the Fighting Belichicks at North Carolina on that Monday night. And I think if they win that game, they could be a really, really interesting team to watch this year. Louisville is also another one, with Jeff Brom there. They always have the potential to be pretty good in the ACC. But it's going to be, with the playoff, there's so many more possibilities. And we're talking about way more teams going into the season than we used to. Maybe not so much who can actually win the national championship, but who can get in the playoff. That's a fun discussion to have right now.
Okay, we were recording this in the middle of July. But in the first week of August, you have a podcast coming out. So why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about this podcast?
Yeah, I'm really excited. This is a project that I've worked on with my friend and colleague, Kyle Bonagura, for years now. It's based on a story that we did back in 2021 for ESPN about the disappearance of the mother of a college football coach named Paul Wolf, who's now the head coach at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo. She went missing from her home back in 1979. Everybody suspected her husband, Paul's dad, of murdering her, but they never could find her body, and so there was never justice for her family. And 41 years later, I won't give it all away, but there's an important phone call that kind of changes everything for the family. So we did that story for ESPN in 4 years ago, and really felt that there was a much larger story to tell we focused a lot of that on Paul because it was an ESPN story, but there were so many other characters and layers to this, and so many of the people we'd interviewed were great storytellers. So we have a podcast called The Unforgotten: Finding Dolores Wolfe. It's part of a true crime feed called The Unforgotten. It's the third season, and we've been spending much of the last 6 months, writing the scripts, and we went and recorded it in Austin about 6 weeks ago, and the first 2 episodes will come out August 4th. So super excited to have it out there in the world, and please subscribe, and it'll be anywhere that you get your podcast, but it's called The Unforgotten: Finding Dolores Wolfe.
Yeah, looking forward to that. It should be really good. Adam, thank you for taking some time before our busy seasons get crazy, and telling our listeners how you broke in.
You bet, Kevin. You're the best, man. Thanks for having me on.